you want to grab people with a hook, give them what's in it for their audience, dress for the job that you want, not the job that you have.
Mm.
And I think that applies here as well, which is if you want to be a public company, start dressing like one, start acting like one well in advance of actually becoming one. Think about the paper trail you're leaving on the internet as a scrappy startup. And if you want people coming back to that when you're public, well, if you're explaining the why behind things and ultimately the value proposition and kind of bringing customers along, you're going to build more credibility.
All right, I'm here with Joe Ciarallo, the VP of Global Communications and Social Media at Wellhub. Wellhub, formerly known as Gympass, is a corporate wellness platform valued at $2.4 billion. There are about 2,000 employees. And before joining Wellhub, Joe was the VP of Communications and PR at Toast, where he led comms during the company's IPO. Before that, VP of Communications at Salesforce. And before that, VP of Comms at Buddy Media, where he was during the time when Salesforce acquired them in 2012. He's also an advisor at Change Engine, which is an internal comms platform for employees. Joe, thank you for joining, and anything to kind of correct or amend there in that intro.
You did great, Finn. Thanks for having me.
Cool, nice. At Salesforce, you led product marketing cloud comms after Buddy Media's acquisition. What did you learn during that time about executive messaging, how to align it during high stakes integrations, and maybe anything that founders can take away from that if they're navigating an acquisition, a product that they acquire that they need to bolt on, any of that sort?
No, thanks, Finn. I joined Salesforce via an acquisition, as you mentioned. I was leading communications at a company called Buddy Media, which was social media marketing software, right when that space was really taking off, right? When social media was so new, right? So the quick story there is we closed in August, and Dreamforce, which is actually happening next week now in San Francisco, that year it was in September. So it was earlier. It was literally a few weeks after the deal. So suddenly we had the whole industry watching essentially to see, what are they going to say? Is this bet going to pay off? And Salesforce had already acquired Radian6, which some folks may know on this podcast, which at the time was the leader in social listening and analytics. So think if you've heard of companies like Brandwatch, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, Sprinkler or Sprout Social. And so we had to show off what this combined entity can do. But when I think about integration messaging, the best messaging answer is one question, which is what can I do today or tomorrow that I couldn't do yesterday, right? Like what's the impact on the customer? And starting there versus just, we acquired this company here, they're great, here's what they do. So 3 things worked out for us well in terms of that M&A integration messaging that I think could be applied to other situations. And they may not always be though, but this is what worked for us at the time. The first was we actually led with category creation. So we didn't just say this is Radian6 plus Buddy Media. We said this is Salesforce Marketing Cloud. So we were the first to announce a marketing cloud. Now that everyone knows MarTech and what a marketing cloud is, Adobe, Oracle, everyone has one. But at the time, that was a bold statement. And I knew it was working because then we had, other people in the industry, well, it's not really a marketing cloud. They don't have B2B marketing automation, or they don't have email. They don't have this, but I said, that's great. We're leading and they're kind of reacting and showing their vision of what a marketing cloud should be. And of course, over time, Salesforce acquired ExactTarget. We acquired other companies to, bring in those capabilities and kind of round that out. So I just think, leading the conversation was super and kind of putting that that stake in the ground. Second, as I mentioned, what can the customers do that they couldn't do previously? And the soundbite we had everywhere is just turn insight into action. Because again, Radian6 had all the listening data, but didn't have paid media or publishing. So, okay, I had all this insight, but what can I really do with it? And then with the combination of the 2 technologies, that really unlocked that customer pain point, right? Of having the data, but not knowing what to do with it and turning it into something. And then third, speaking about the bigger industry shift at play. So at the time, then our messaging was about social media isn't just this specialized team with the intern sitting in the corner. This is your marketing, right? This is foundational to your marketing. And even a decade later, that's still a conversation we're having today, right? Of social first marketing or social first creative. And it's clearly true now, but at the time, again, it was a bold, statement. So I think those three things, category creation may not work for everyone, but that certainly was the right moment for us, focusing on the customer pain point. And then again, speaking about the industry shifts at play, not just the products you've acquired. So it was a really fun time. It was probably one of the busiest weeks of my career because, again, we were the star of the show at Dreamforce. I'm interested to see what Salesforce does next week at Dreamforce with, I imagine it'll be more around Agentforce and AI. So I think Salesforce still has that playbook, right? I think Agentforce last year at Dreamforce, again, about really kind of defining and owning the category and leaving no confusion in the audience's mind about what the key message is.
Yeah, I love those three. And I know we're going a little bit off track here, but I'm curious. This was in 2012. Now, the three themes that you mentioned, or the three lessons, totally apply to today. I'm curious about the channel. It's like, I'm assuming back then there was heavy reliance on PRs and news outlets. Do you think today in 2025, if you had to orchestrate this, would you be leaning more heavily on, let's say, Mark Benioff's personal LinkedIn profile to announce these things?
It's completely changed, as you mentioned. I think we would still, what I say to people is that owned and earned bounce off each other and they influence each other. So it's not about, I'm not going to talk to CNBC because I'm posting on LinkedIn, right? They complement each other. So if it were today, yes, you'd see much more of a healthy mix. We were, of course, posting on social media then because that is what the product did, and our executives were very active. Back then, it was more Twitter X focused, was kind of the pulse of the world in the media. So that was actually more important than LinkedIn. Now I would say it's more of a mix. There isn't that one kind of global town square like there used to be
Right.
with Twitter, right? And now for a B2B audience, it's much more LinkedIn focused. So yes, you'd see more of a mix there. We'd be talking to people like you, right? People who are not necessarily full-time journalists, but reach the audience. And even if you look at the interviews Mark Benioff has been doing in the last year in the run up to Dreamforce, it's much
20 VC.
more VC, yeah, 20-minute VC, Logan Bartlett show. He's on a lot of these kind of podcasts and YouTube shows that maybe in the past he'd say, oh, maybe that's good for our product person or other people, but I'll talk to, Jim Cramer at CNBC. And now you're seeing him still do Jim Cramer on CNBC, but also talk to some of these folks that he knows are really plugged into the tech world and really plugged into his audience.
I mean, when you reach out to a podcast, you try to reach out to Harry Stebbings of 20 VC. I assume similar principles apply as if you're trying to reach a journalist or a reporter at the Wall Street Journal or TechCrunch, trying to get your executive, your news item placed. Or do you think there's something fundamentally different about that outreach? And if it's similar, I don't know if you can share any tips on how to get placed on these things. Like, if you know what reporters care about, it's probably similar to what a podcast host might be caring about.
It can be similar. The difference is with a lot of the podcasts and like what we're doing today is we have more time, right? So there are fewer reporters that are going to sit down with you for an hour and post the whole hour of video on YouTube. That does still exist sometimes, potentially if you're going to their conference, but even then it's more likely to be a 15 or 20-minute session, right? So you have the depth that you can do. So that's where I prepare executives and I say, if you're going to do a podcast, you really have to be able to go deep on the product, your story, like really be able to fill that space and be compelling, right? Versus if you're doing a CNBC hit for your news, maybe you have 5 minutes or less, right? So you really have to, so the way you prep the executives is much different, right? And you really have to educate them on the differences there. Some of the pitching, best practices can be the same, Finn, right? You want to grab people with a hook, right? You want to know give them what's in it for their audience. I find a lot of the podcasters, in some senses, can be less news or scoop driven, although that is changing a little bit, right? But maybe they don't care as much about the exclusive, right? Because if you're at the Wall Street Journal or CNBC or Financial Times or name the publication, that's how, in some ways, you're being evaluated for your job, right? How many exclusives or scoops are you getting versus your competitor? Versus podcasters, they just want to connect with their community and grow their audience, right? So that they might love it if it's, time to your funding announcement or something else, but it can sometimes be a week later, right? And they just want to digest what happened in that first week or two since you announced your big round, right? They're not as scoop driven. The last thing I would say is also look at paid partnerships too. So if there's a podcast or influencer that's really relevant in your space, right? Chances are you're not going to, they don't, not a full pay to play episode. I don't see people doing that, but of course they all have things like job boards or newsletters or different types of, advertising that they offer or sponsored content. So also look into that and support them as independent media, right? And that'll go a long way to show that you want to have a long-term relationship with this person and support them and not just use them as quote unquote a distribution vehicle for your news.
That's super interesting. Yeah. Now, as we talk about, getting a, let's say, startup scrappy engine ready for IPO, you were there at Toast when Toast IPO'd. Obviously, startups are scaling faster and faster these days. So I do think it becomes more important for even, mid-sized startups to start thinking about this. So how do you think about the shift of scrappy engine to becoming IPO grade comms function, given that you built this out in 2021 for Toast?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So there's that classic phrase, dress for the job that you want, not the job that you have.
Mm.
And I think that applies here as well, which is if you want to be a public company, start dressing like one, start acting like one well in advance of actually becoming one. And that could be 18 to 24 months in advance. And typically at a high level, the shift I see a lot of companies and founders make is maybe they had communications, but it was a manager level person doing more, thinking of PR as more of a marketing distribution channel like email or social. And it's like it's a list on the list of channels where you blast out information, you send out the press release or blog post, you kind of see what you get back, and then the executive does interviews, versus a strategic function that is shaping the narrative and the message of the company tied to business goals, right, across stakeholder audiences, and is really leading the narrative and leading where the company is going in partnership with the leadership team. Of course, also looking closely at risks, right, and crisis work, and kind of what risks do we have and what we can mitigate. So those are some of the high level. I think tactically, what I tell a lot of companies to look at is really define what course of business is for you and what quiet period means for you. I think people assume, especially maybe as they're doing their roadshow or once they are public and they're doing earnings calls, that a quiet period means you can't say anything. And that's not correct. I mean, obviously, you don't want to, you're not going to put out material news or something where your investor relations counterpart can't speak to analysts at that time, right? But if you're doing normal course of business, product updates, or your founder speaking at a conference talking about just what the product does, right? The value prop, kind of general course of business, and you have a frequency in which you've done that, then investors are saying, oh, this is just normally what you do, right? So there's no change here. So establishing that framework in advance, establishing spokespeople, making sure they're well prepped and they have swim lanes. So is your CFO going to go deep on the financials and the unit economics of the business? Is your co-founder or chief product officer going to go deep into the founding story and the product vision? At Toast, we were very intentional about that. So the four spokespeople, our co-founders, our CEO, and our CFO, all knew what role they would play, right? Where they would go deep, which media they would meet with, and what was the goal of meeting with those media. And we had all but one of our interviews convert to media coverage, which is very high. So by being deliberate about that, we had a very high coverage ratio from coverage interview to coverage ratio. The last thing I'll say quickly on this is think about, you mentioned, scrappy startup to IPO. Think about the paper trail you're leaving on the internet as a scrappy startup, and if you want people coming back to that when you're public. So for example, when you're a startup, you may say like, we grew this product 300% or something, or we have this many customers in this country. And are those things you're going to disclose when you're public or not, right? And if not, try to clean up your digital archive, essentially, right? If you don't want reporters going back to that and say, hey, I heard you were really crushing it in the UK and your growth rate was this, and you have this many customers, and maybe you're not disclosing those regional metrics yet as a public company. And now you have to kind of explain why. And sometimes reporters may infer that you're not disclosing it because maybe things aren't going as well. And that might not be the case at all, right? But reporters sometimes make those connections.
Love it. Now, I mean, you've been in PR and comms leadership for 15 years, particularly in B2B tech. And we already touched on some, I'm sure, but what are the trends that you're seeing? How is the playbook changing, or how has the playbook changed in those 15 years? And what are you watching today that matters more than maybe ever before?
Well, we touched on them already. I'll expand a little bit. And the two ones that we all know, but we have to continue to stay on top of, are content distribution and AI. So we talked earlier about how we used to be more dependent on intermediaries, media analysts or others, to tell the story. And now with your company and your CEO, you can build this really powerful distribution, right? On LinkedIn, on your website, your community, et cetera. So, Finn, you're a great advocate for this because this is what you help companies do. So I would say that is the first one, and just staying on top of when things get stale and everyone's doing the same kind of thing on LinkedIn, how are you doing something new and different? And the second is obviously AI. I've never felt things change this fast. I was just reminding myself back to we started on social media in the interview that it took Facebook 4.5 years to reach 100 million users, and it took ChatGPT 2 months.
Right.
So just the speed really is unlike anything we've ever seen. So when it comes to content, I just referenced that. Then when it comes to AI, I'm really interested in externally, where can AI be used successfully, and then where will it not be, frankly. So I think sometimes we see consumer brands like J. Crew put out a catalog with a AI generated mail model, and it wasn't received well because part of J. Crew's brand is these beautiful photos and these photo shoots in great locations with real people, right? But on the other hand, in B2B tech, if you're using AI avatars for a training video or a product demo, reaching other people who are working in AI or B2B, it'll probably work just fine, right? If that'll help you. So I'm really interested in kind of the audience reception to AI generated content, and where is it just table stakes and you just say, hey, this was generated by AI and it works great, and where are people going to expect, no, I want to see Finn on his podcast talking to humans. I don't want to see an avatar of Finn on his podcast.
I mean, let me bounce something off of you, because this is where I'm thinking, which is thought leadership, right? Like, by definition, AI cannot create thought leadership for you, because it's just trained on a predictive model that will say something average predictive, which is maybe
Yes.
great if you want to create a press release announcement, and you just feed it a couple of facts that you want to let the world know, and that's about it. But if you want to be a thought leader, and whether that's your company or your executives, your CEO, your founder, your other senior executives, you can't just tell an LLM, hey, give me a thought leading opinion on where the wellness industry is going, because by definition, it can't do that. Does that mean, by conclusion, in your opinion, that thought leadership will be even more important, because that's how you can differentiate yourself when everyone else is using AI?
That's what we're seeing, right? And back to my point earlier about what will audiences react to positively versus mixed or negative, you're seeing that on LinkedIn, right? Where people can kind of say, oh, this seems like just Claude wrote this, or whatever agent wrote this, right?
Yeah.
And there's not much unique there. And it's kind of checking the box content versus, yeah, maybe Claude assisted, right? But it has some real human, right, and unique thought leadership to it. And a lot of the comms people you speak to on this show and that I speak to, right, of course, we're all creating our custom agents with all of our proprietary data and messaging. So when we are co-creating with AI, it's coming from we have some differentiation there, right? It has our data, it has our point of view built into the agent. So we can still move faster, right? And not have to start from scratch and kind of work with an agent. But it's not just this, frankly, cookie cutter messaging that anyone can produce with a few prompts.
I am curious to get your take on this as we are speaking about trends, because I'm a millennial. I grew up with social media. I'm kind of used to putting it all out there in some sense, transparency. Do you think transparency and the transparency that customers and people expect from their companies and from the executives at the companies, is that changing, or has it been like, was it like that 15 years ago too, and just the medium changed? Like, is transparency a trend from what you've seen?
It's a great question. I think transparency, but I would say more just even it's an overused word, but authenticity.
Mm,
So explaining, companies are always managing change and communicating change. And if you explain why, you're going to be in a much better place. I was listening to an interview with the head of social for Ryanair, who
mm,
right, or former head of social. Now he runs an agency like you, and he was saying we would get all these complaints. Oh my gosh, you hustle me off the plane, or this is crazy, this is different. But when we actually explained how we do things and why we do them to offer you this great price, and now you're able to
mm.
go from Germany to Italy for 50 euro and not 400. There was much more understanding because we were opening up the curtain and saying, yeah, we know you have to get off the plane in 15 minutes. It's very quick. But here's why we put these policies in place so we can get more people access to flying, essentially. That's a consumer example, but I think that applies to B2B as well. If you're explaining the why behind things and ultimately the value proposition and kind of bringing customers along, you're going to build more credibility than just, announcing the change outright.
Love it. Now, how important are traditional media relationships with journalists compared to going direct and publishing through your executives' channels like
Yeah.
LinkedIn? I mean, you said both are important, but how do you weigh them nowadays?
Again, I think it's when I was a journalist, I always looked at the digital footprint of who I was interviewing and what were they talking about? Are they interesting? And sometimes even do they have a large audience, right? If I'm getting pitched three different experts on a certain topic and one has tons of followers, is really engaging, and the other one isn't active at all, and they're kind of the same level of executive, right? Or I'm going to pick the person that has that bigger footprint online, right? That's
Mm,
going to circulate my story. Now, not all journalists think that way, but again, they really play owned drives earned, and they really play off each other. So I see a lot of companies still wanting, whether it's a big funding announcement or a big milestone, they still want the credibility that Wall Street Journal or CNBC logo brings, especially if you're selling into enterprise, if you're selling into highly regulated industries. There's still that stamp of credibility, right, that those business publications bring. And then they're complementing that with, again, well, things we've talked about, the podcasts, the newsletters, their own content as well. So I think, again, you have to be thinking about it holistically and knowing that it's all playing off each other. And one of the things I say to founders a lot is just try, frankly. I think sometimes a founder or CEO may come across things, oh, I haven't heard of this podcast, or is this audience really big? And I say, well, here's the actual audience data. And I'm not going to tell founders to go on something super niche or super small where it's
right,
reaching no one. But if it's reaching a decent enough audience, I say, let's give it a try, right? If anything, frankly, it's good practice for you to do this, right?
right.
It's low stakes, right? And also, again, you're building that digital footprint. And then when these reporters are searching you, trying to get a little more color on who is this person, right? They now have that digital footprint. So that's what I'm seeing again. I don't think it's an either or of we have to disintermediate the media and just go direct. It's really about being smart across both, and seeing how they both play off each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like a flywheel. Before this conversation, we were talking about Uli Leragor, the former CMO and chief evangelist at Gong. And one of the things he talks about in his book is basically guerrilla marketing tactics that make you look bigger than you are. And one example of that is, you know, how there's these like at Times Square, you can get these ads, or like the NASDAQ announcement, NASDAQ congratulates so and so.
Yes.
And then companies do that, but then the point is not so much how many people you actually reach at Times Square, is so that then your founder can take a selfie in front of that massive screen at Times Square and then post that on LinkedIn, and that post will just do really well because it's an awesome picture and people are like, wow, that's, you know, that's cool that you got that announcement, right? Or your executive speaks at some big conference and does a keynote there, but then you also record it and post a video later on LinkedIn, so it all plays into each other.
It does. And you make a great point. A lot of this doesn't exist for the actual moment, right? The 5 seconds it's in Times Square or the 200 people that saw you at the conference. It exists because you're distributing it, right,
Yeah.
to the world, right? So you really make a great point. I joke that has a company, really arrived until they have a billboard between, the airport and downtown San Francisco.
Mm. Now, I mean, we now talked about how, you know, the old PR is still relevant. Do you think there are any practices in PR or communications that will look absolutely outdated in 24 months and we'll look back at, you know, the old times of
Yeah.
comms?
Yeah, I think some things that are already looking outdated now and will look even more outdated a year or two out. I think the first is separate internal and external communications. So I think sometimes founders look at these things completely differently. And at the end of the day, it's just communication. And the first audience you need to communicate to is your employees. Because if they don't understand it and they're not on board, how is someone outside the company going to understand it? Right. And that's what I think I've seen a lot of change there, especially with the speed at which things move, and really having to communicate thoughtfully. So that's where I see a lot of companies, and you talked a lot about on your podcast too, around how more employees are becoming external influencers or brand
Mhm.
ambassadors, right? So they really have to understand the message. And that's a very cost efficient way of scaling your awareness and your messages through your employee base. So I just think whether it reports into comms or not, it's at least working really closely together, right? Sometimes that function reports into HR and comms is its own function or into marketing, but really making sure they're tied closely together. The second one that I think people say is outdated, but I actually don't think it's outdated if done correctly, is the press release. So do we want to do corporate jargon filled, traditional press releases? No. But back to owned media, do we want to think of ourselves as a media company and tell our own story and write our own news stories? And is that, I'm reading reports from Muckrack and other companies looking at all of the studies around what's influencing citations and LLMs, and press releases can be very effective. One example I love there is if people were following the saga between Rippling and Deal,
Yeah.
two HR tech companies, right? Rippling was covering that story as if they were a media company. If you look at their website, so they were actually putting out what read like news stories. It didn't read like press releases, and that was getting picked up in tech meme and it's getting cited everywhere because they were breaking their own news on their own website. Essentially, it's just still a press release, but it's not written in that form. So I would say something that people think is outdated, but actually is not when done right, is the press release, or you can just call it news writing or news stories, right? And influencing LLMs and influencing your audiences via the content you put on your newsroom.
Now, does that also mean that, do you believe that as more companies go direct, not exclusively, but definitely building out this kind of owned audience, that both the skill of communications becomes a more important skill for the founder CEO, and in translation, the head of comms, the chief communications officer role will be a more important strategic role in the future?
We're seeing that be a more important role. It's a time where there's a lot of demand. Everyone I know who's went off and started their own firm, either doing something like you're doing or doing more of a integrated offering across, owned and earned, they're doing really well because the demand is there, right? And I think the executives are realizing now, especially in this time of, geopolitical unevenness and just, they have to be prepared. They have to really understand that their brand and the company brand are one and the same. And in
Mm-hmm.
many ways, their brand is almost more important than the company brand for reaching people. So you're seeing that realization now with CEOs and founders, and also in the industry, that this is not just a nice to have, like I mentioned early before, of someone blasting out press releases and just kind of seeing what you get back. It has to be strategic, and you have to have buy-in from the founder so that they're well prepared, they know why it matters, and you're not reacting, right? When something good or bad happens, you're not scrambling. You're on offense as much as possible.
Now, when you're talking to your CEO, to your founder, to your execs, and you're coaching them on how to do comms and how to communicate and how to do all these things, what are some of the recurring themes? What are some of the principles that you notice yourself maybe repeating to those founders and
Yeah.
execs?
I think the hardest thing for CEOs and founders is understanding that they're not just a spokesperson for the company or the product, but they're a spokesperson for the industry, or even bigger than the industry,
Mm,
societal shifts or things, right? Because, once you get to be a bigger company, yes, you have people that are assigned to cover Google or OpenAI, right? And they have to cover your company because you've reached that size and scale, but that's few and far between, right? Most people are writing about AI or B2B marketing or future of work, right? So you have to associate brand association, right? We all talk about that in marketing. You have to associate yourself with that category. So that's a lot of what I think founders, it's a big unlock for them when they realize that, but it is a struggle because they're so passionate about their product. And I get that.
mm,
And you have to sell and you have to grow the company. And I completely understand that. But I think, when you can really zoom out and kind of say, okay, what do I stand for in terms of a business leader, which is more my product? What do I stand for as an industry leader? At Wellhub, that's, employee well-being, how people and culture and the health of your employees is strategic, not just a perk. Right. So what do you stand for as an industry leader? What do you stand for as a true thought leader? So beyond the industry, right? Some of these societal things. And then frankly, who are you as an individual? I think people, and you see this on LinkedIn, people can never get enough of those, what is the morning routine of Jeff Bezos, or, kind of who are you as a person and what makes you tick? So those are four areas where I try to really pull more from people to try to learn more. Because I think the first one on the product and why they started the company, that's what I call their happy place and where
right.
they're most natural. And you try to get them to expand from there, right? To be more well-rounded and more interesting to the audience that's interested in more topics, right? Not just their company.
Do you have any framework during a crisis? Say there's an outage, or recently there was the situation with astronomer of the CEO going viral.
Yeah.
Do you have any framework on kind of how to decide who should communicate this, who should talk on this? Should it be the CEO? Should it be just the company page? How do you think about this?
Well, I think generally on crisis, of course, you want to have playbooks and frameworks, because I know you're in Germany, but to use a baseball analogy in the US, you of course want to start on second or third base and not on home plate, right? You
Hmm.
want to have this, but then again, you can't be too rigid because each situation is different. So you want to have the frameworks and the playbooks so you can move fast. Generally what we've agreed upon as a company, but you also have to be ready to adjust. It depends on the scale, right? I think astronomers, some of the things that you mentioned, where it's impacting literally every stakeholder audience, may make sense, of course, for the CEO to speak personally,
Hmm.
right, on that. Other areas where it's product, at Salesforce, for example, Parker Harris, the co-founder, thankfully these were few and far between, but occasionally when there was some sort of issue, Parker was out there on Twitter X at the time. We also had trust.salesforce.com, which was the agreed upon site where we post about all of our product updates. So we had that, but again, to your point, that wasn't done, of course, on the fly. That was part of our playbook, so everyone knew, okay, here's who's going to be commenting on this. But I think the bigger picture is, what you're saying, who needs to hear it, and what do you want them to feel or do, right? So we've had some issues recently. I think CrowdStrike came to mind, where the CEO was out there, and they've cleaned this up a lot, but the initial reaction was he actually didn't apologize, and it seemed to lack empathy, right? So again, the CEO was out there, but the message wasn't well received from the audience. So I think first starting with, again, what's the message you need to deliver to whom, and what do you want them to take away from it first, and then get into kind of the messenger and the outlet, whether it's your own website or media or a combination of the both.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, you've maintained your own LinkedIn executive profile, and you regularly share opinions and thought leadership pieces yourself. What advice would you have to other execs at companies who are looking to do this, who are interested in doing this, on, I don't know, even mindset, why should they do it? And then just like some practical tips on how to overcome the barrier.
No, this was a big shift for me, kind of posting on LinkedIn or even doing things like this. I think there's a lot of people certainly in the communications industry, that were raised that, you're the person, you are not the story. You're making someone else the story, right? And there was a little bit of this, you don't talk about Fight Club kind of vibe,
Right.
right? Like, we don't do this. And that's just completely changed, right? Especially in the last 5 years. And I think if you're not doing this, you're invisible, and you want to be visible in this market, right? You want people to know who you are and what you stand for. So that was a big shift for me of, hey, I'm not going to change careers and be an influencer or a creator, but I'm going to start doing some of this and sharing my point of view, and really with the goal of trying to just get what's in my head out of my head and onto the internet, right? And hopefully it can help people or inspire them. And again, back to what I said about coaching founders, not promotional, right? Most of the content I want to be just sharing insights, being helpful. Maybe occasionally I will weave in something, for the company, or something that's a little more promotional. But I tell people, just try, if you're staying away from especially, frankly, controversial topics, and more just talking about marketing or different things you're seeing, there really is fairly low risk. So just try. I think you've had a lot of guests on that have said that. Just, it's very intimidating, but just kind of post and iterate, look at the data. Don't worry about some complex framework even to start with. Just start doing, and don't let perfect get in the way of good enough, right? And share those things that might seem obvious to you, but maybe a lot of people out there don't know how those things work. The decision-making process behind something, or how you think about something. And the last thing I would say is, for me, I try to have a high do to say ratio in my life. So if I'm telling other people this is valuable and they should be doing it, I should be doing it. I don't want to say, hey, you should make wellness a part of your life and work out and meditate and do these things, and then I'm not doing it. So I think it also helps as a comms professional, where, yeah, again, still primarily you want to be amplifying the executive, and whether you're at an agency, the clients you work at, or if you're in-house, that should be your primary role. You don't want to become the story, but where you can be more of an advocate, right, and have a point of view, it shows that you have skin in the game too. You know how this works, and you're actively working on it as well, not just advising other people on how to do it.
Right. And I mean, if you do it thoughtfully, it's both good for you because you get to build an audience, it helps you in your career, you get to sharpen your thoughts, and you're more of an asset to your company, right? Because as we discussed in this episode, you now have an audience that you can use to share company news or stuff that's happening there, be an advocate, and help them build brand awareness. I had Brian Law on the show a couple of weeks ago, who's the CMO at Sentinel One and previously CMO at ZoomInfo, and Henry Schuck, his CEO back then, who's also very active on LinkedIn. He just went up to him and he was like, "You need to be active on LinkedIn because it's helping the business, and you just need
Yeah.
to figure out how to do this." So,
Yeah. And CEOs leading by example. I think a lot of times you hear, oh, I don't have time for that. And then you say, well, the CEO has time for it. And maybe they're not writing every post, but they are involved. They're not just completely outsourcing it to someone, right? Even if they have some level of help. And at smaller companies, maybe they don't have much help. So I've always said, if the C-suite can find time for it, and you have to lead by example there, right?
right.
And good leaders are doing that. To your point, they're going to, whether it's a regional GM in an important market or the product officer, and saying, hey, why is your LinkedIn empty for the last 6 months, right? What are
Right.
you doing to help, advocate and grow the company here?
There we go, Joe. Thank you so much for taking the time. We went through a ton of stuff. I learned a lot. If people want to check you out, I'll link up both your LinkedIn and then Wellhub's website down below. Any last thoughts? Anything I should have asked that I didn't ask?
No, this was really fun. Love your show. I think you're covering a really important topic and area in the comms world right now.
Thank you. Awesome.